that could be interesting.
Oh, okay.
Greetings, everyone, as we start on time for this topic of a lost decade question mark. Are we going to lose it or not? I've said to our panellists that maybe we've got one of the more depressing topics, but the whole idea of WEF is to look for solutions and find ways through the times we live in. And they're not just interesting times, they're in many respects very shocking times, so it requires even more of a step up than we might ever have imagined at this point in human history. You turn on the news every day, you think, am I living in this dystopia which we've created as human beings? This is not good. We've seen our planet brought to the edge of its boundaries and beyond in some cases. We walked into a global pandemic because we weren't ready and we were slow to respond. And then in the past 3 months, we have just seen this horrible tragedy unfold with the war in Ukraine. Tragic for Ukrainians, first and foremost, but with spillover impacts globally. There's been a lot of talk here at Davos of the food and energy price spikes and what this is going to do to the poorest around our world. Of course, the huge numbers of forcibly displaced people over the borders of Ukraine. We're now seeing some of really the best of the traditional donors diverting money out of their development budgets to settle refugees in their countries. That's less money for humanitarian support and the other things that these budgets cover. And then we worry about the shadow that this toxic geopolitics now will cast over our capacity to solve these big shared challenges of climate and the threats to biodiversity and ongoing poverty and hunger and. So none of this is the way we would want the world to be. So the big question is, what can we do about it? Can we course correct? If so, and over what time frame? And I've got a wonderful panel that's going to help us answer these questions. I have Kiril Petkov, the Prime Minister of Bulgaria. I have Hina Rabbani-Carr, who is Minister of State for Foreign Affairs from Pakistan. And I have Carolyn Anstey, President and CEO of PACT USA, which is an international development organisation, works in close to 40 countries, looking for human development solutions. Remember, we're being live streamed. We're happy for you to tweet your heart's desires with hashtag WEF22. So let me come to Prime Minister Petkov. In these troubled times, share with us just a bit about the realities your country's been facing.
Thank you. I'll actually focus on the specifics of the Ukrainian war and the European situation, what we have done as a mistake in the last decade, and I hope in the second part of the debate and discussion to tell you what I think we could do and use this problem as an opportunity. So it should not be a depressing discussion. It should be, as you said, very clearly find the path forward. So in 2014, we all saw the taking over of Crimea. And we thought, oh, that's very negative. We had a lot of political criticism towards Putin. But at the same time, we didn't do our serious homework of strategic next steps that could have made it very different today if we had done them. First of all, we allowed for a lot of the gas storages of Europe to be owned by Gazprom, which creates incredible dependency. Instead of thinking of how to decrease the dependency, we built Turkey Stream, which is one of the big pipes going through Turkey into Europe, again, Gazprom gas. And we also built Nord Stream, which now was almost about to be turned on before Germany said no, which also increased the dependency. We tied our electrical prices with our gas prices, which meant that Russia could not only decrease the supply of gas, but can regulate our electrical prices throughout Europe. We allowed our embassies to be filled with agents. Little Bulgaria, for example, we have 118 diplomats in the embassy of Sofia that are Russian, and Greece is a very similar number next to us, and Romania as well. We kind of opened the door for hybrid attacks. We also didn't think strategically about our defense strategy, and we didn't think about the eastern flank, the logistics. We don't really have corridors south-north to move troops, goods along the eastern flank. So we kind of were criticizing politically. We did all the political discussion, yet our dependency increased. Our strategic thinking was not there. And now, last year, as the gas supply was decreased, the gas storages were turned down from Russia, we all felt all of a sudden we're in the midst of crisis just before the war started, a war that we could not respond as much as we would like because of these dependencies. So this is the current situation, and there are clear answers what we can do forward, and I really hope that in another decade we'll not have this discussion, but the next discussion will be what lessons did we learn the first time that made us much more stable, much stronger, much less dependent, both for dependency to Russia, but also, as you said, for the health of the planet.
Yeah. So, a lot of lessons not learned, which you're now very quickly learning and moving forward, and we'll come back to that. Minister Hina from Pakistan, the realities for your country at the moment.
Okay, so interestingly, I noticed that you did not mention a very big reality which has a very big impact on my country in your what has gone wrong in the world, and that is Afghanistan. And I mentioned this specifically because this is what does. A new crisis comes up, and a crisis that we leave behind gets left behind. And then whether it's a humanitarian disaster and people are dying, and UNDP tells us that 97% of the people are going to be below poverty line, it doesn't matter to the world because the world is looking somewhere else. Now, the problem with such a framework or happening is that the impact on the people, which is in this case 40 million Afghans, is not undone when the world starts to look away. The impact on them continues to happen, right? And then the impact on countries like ours who have a 2,600 kilometer border with them also continues to happen. And as we have said repeatedly, and I would like to say this again, because many a times Pakistan finds itself in a very difficult position. We find ourselves in a position where we are, it seems, the expectation of the West, of the international community is superimposed on us at the same time as the expectation of what is now the interim Afghan government is also superimposed on us. And Pakistan finds itself carrying at the same time two briefs and not having the ability to articulate and put forward what is its own brief, what it is its own policy. So I would perhaps want to take a minute to be able to do that, because we feel very strongly that as a country which has constitutional provisions for women to be part of normal, equally part of the Pakistani society, the Pakistani classrooms, the Pakistani parliament, the Pakistani banks, the Pakistani workspace, we find it obviously distressful that our sisters and women across the border will be curtailed in ways that they are, right? And we find it just more than distressful that some of that thought process may permeate through the border and find its space, which is obviously a threat. I consider that to be a threat for Pakistan. Now, having said that, because of that grandstanding moral position that a lot of the international community also has and shares with Pakistan perhaps, shall we enable the complete implosion of the Afghan economy and also the starvation of the Afghan people so that we can hold our moral position? I find that to be equally threatening to us. So Pakistan feels threatened in some ways, and being in the space which we didn't want to own, which we don't choose for ourselves. So just wanting to put it on over here, because I look at Ukraine being nowhere similar, but when the attention of the world comes, it also goes away very quickly. But right now, when we talk about negotiation as an option in Ukraine, and a lot of people say, no, not until this happens, the people who are suffering, the collateral damage that is happening is not about countries who are summoning, perhaps, but of the Ukrainian people, just as in Afghanistan, of the Afghan people, and then some of the spillover of the Pakistani people also. So I think in some ways I find it, I want to be optimistic, but in the way we have seen interventions play out in the last 2 decades, I'm quite pessimistic about how we leave the leftovers and the repercussions and the ramifications and start looking for the new place where to put all our minds to, and then perhaps and while all of this is happening on the international stage, both humanity and the planet is being threatened or like never before. Two things that, and I often say that every time Time magazine would have a cover story on the next pandemic coming, I would turn it around and say, no, not my problem. And it became our problem. It became a common problem, right? And much as the pandemic also gave us some hope, because I think we were very good with being able to come up with vaccines quite quickly, it also taught us a lesson that if we only try to preserve ourselves, as in me, if self-preservation and not the others, not preserving others will come back to harm you. Because when vaccines were not judiciously distributed, the pandemic found its way to, the virus found its way to mutate into various forms, and then we all had to suffer because of those choices that were made. And at the same time, so that's on humanity, and then I'll add on to that, in some ways, obviously exacerbated by the conflict in Ukraine, but the food security crisis. Okay, so 20 years from today, we were looking at a food security challenge, and today we are looking at a food security crisis. So have we gained or have we lost? And I find it difficult to live with a situation where we have actually lost more than we have gained. Then, in the very same way as the pandemic is something that you would go like, not my problem, climate change, not my problem. Well, guess what? It is all of our problems, okay? Because now the climate, Pakistan had one of its hottest months in years, perhaps the hottest in our history. Bangladesh is currently suffering from a very bad flood. We've had flash floods. So climate change is now saying to us, I'm not a problem that you have to deal with in the future, I'm a problem that you've already made, right? And in order to deal with all of those global challenges, we had this thing called in 2015, two big ticket items where I think 2015 was still the time where the world was working together to deal with the challenges rather than create more challenges. And in that framework, we had the SDGs and we had the Paris Climate Agreement. And I had to be reminded by my colleagues that there was a commitment made of about $100 billion to enable developing countries to deal with the climate change requirements, processes, systems. I don't even want to look at the number in terms of how much have we made. So what I'm saying is, the long and short of it is that we have humanity and planet being challenged like perhaps not in the last many decades. And our answer to that is that the world order as it existed also is also teetering away, and we have no, so we're finding answers in tactical form in some ways, and creating fissures and divisions which are us versus them, which is creating a world which is a dangerous world, one in which we are not looking at ourselves as us, but as us versus them.
Well, you're right that media attention, world attention moves on very, very quickly. Remember August last year, it was Afghanistan wall to wall.
Absolutely.
But the CNN effect says that sooner or later that story gets stale. And let's be honest, once Western countries had evacuated their nationals, the story went stale.
Yeah.
And the Afghans were left with the very dismal consequences. And we could add to the ignoring now of Afghanistan, Myanmar. Things are bad. Tigray and Ethiopia, things are bad. Yemen, they're still bad. Syria, all the military coups in West Africa. But at the moment, it's Ukraine, although I feel watching media now, the media want to move on from that too. Ukraine starts to slip from the headlines, despite the horror. I mean, over 13 million people forcibly displaced. It is not a small number of people. And of course, well over a quarter of the population. So it is distressing. Carolyn, what are you seeing from the PAC perspective?
So, Helen, I think you did a great job at the beginning of outlining all the problems: food crisis, fuel crisis, fertilizer crisis for many. I guess I would add another F, which is fiscal crisis. There's so much that needs to be done, and many countries are essentially bankrupt. They have no funds to do it. I remember the last time we met here in Davos in person, January 2020, walking down the promenade, and all the stores that are taken over by businesses. In every window, you saw the Sustainable Development Goals. You saw sustainability. I haven't heard, you're the first person in the 4 days that I've been here to mention the SDGs. So I think a lot of things are falling off the agenda, and even sustainability and climate is not as dominant as it once was. I would add to that progress on gender going backwards. Enormous, you talked about the schism or the them and us between countries, but it's also within countries.
Absolutely.
A lot of countries very, very divided internally, polarized. And across the world, the polls tell us there's a lack of trust in institutions. So Helen, you talk about how we can all come together to fix things, but there is a lot of lack of trust. So that's essentially the bad news of what I see, and I do worry about development assistance being diverted away. We already see some European budgets. Instead of being spent overseas, they're all going to be spent at home now on the refugee crisis. And we know in the development community, getting additionality is extra money is always very difficult. That's the bad news. What's the good news? I do see a glimmer of good news, and that is all those people here at Davos who are working on development, everybody's talking about localization. Because there's no trust necessarily in big institutions, in government, people are now saying problems have to be solved at the local level. Because COVID essentially had to be delivered at the local level, we've empowered local communities. And for so long, we've talked about stakeholders, we've talked about beneficiaries. Now we're starting to talk about solutionaries, people at the local level who will make their own solutions. And I think we've built this network now to deliver vaccines. We now have to pivot it to deliver healthcare, to deliver education, to empower those communities to hold governments accountable through stronger civil society, stronger media. So I think in that localization emphasis, there has to be buy-in, there has to be ownership at the local level. That's what we do at PACT. We work with local communities. That is a real hope for the future.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Kind of anticipates the next question I was going to throw to the Prime Minister, which is you now see the lessons that needed to be learned. So tell us about how Bulgaria is pivoting to take on these challenges and where you think that's going to lead you.
Yeah, it's the opportunity is there. And so what happened to us, we were the most gas-dependent country in Europe to Russia. We were over 95% dependency. And they asked us to pay in rubles. And we said no. And everybody was very surprised because we were supposed to say yes the fastest. Because when you're 95% dependent, you should be the fastest to say yes. But we said no. And so we became from 95% dependent to 0% dependent over 1 week. The question is, how can you pull this off? And this is the starting of the lessons, and I think we're learning it through COVID, and now we're learning it through energy. We have to act together. So we looked at this opportunity where, how can we diversify right away? And we saw that the economics, and that's interesting because helping out other countries could be not only a positive thing to do for the common good, but also a very profitable venture. So in our case, if you look at the prices, Henry Hub prices in the US are 26 euros per megawatt. The market in Europe, Gazprom prices were at about 70 euros per megawatt. So you can help out a region, Eastern Europe, and still make over 2.5 times your money. As long as you see it as an opportunity and as long as we can act together, communicate together, and act fast. So over the next 30 days, we were able to get alternative supply. We were able to look into not only for us, that was interesting. So you were saying it very well. We cannot look only for us. We started looking at our gas infrastructure on a regional level. If we can diversify ourselves, potentially we can use the same method of LNG through Turkey and Greece to go for the whole Balkans. And actually what pipes used to go from Ukraine, Russia, Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, Turkey, now we can reverse them back. How about we start pushing the gas up from Greece, Turkey, Bulgaria, Romania, Ukraine? Why is this important? When you look at it at the regional level, there are synergies. Synergies that if you look in country by country, you cannot. For example, Ukraine right now has over excess supply of electricity. If they can supply electricity from Ukraine to Romania, Romania doesn't have to buy as much electricity from us. We can sell this electricity to Greece, which can then change their consumption of gas because they use gas for electricity. All of a sudden, we have less use of gas, more optimal use of the system level, and using the existing infrastructure to look at it on a regional level, decreasing our dependency. The second part is when we talk about sustainability. I mean, this is the best time if you want to decrease dependency, also to increase your sustainability. So I'm proud to say we're launching now a project, the biggest grid battery project in Europe, where we're going to put over 6,000 megawatt hours of battery storage on a grid level with a lot of solar electricity supply, so that we can have a base load based on the sun. So all of a sudden, not because we really love to do it, but because we had to do it, but with looking at it as an opportunity, my hope is that by the end of the year, we can say we have no dependency on Russia on gas, and we have a lot more green economy than before, and now the coordination between us in the region has increased because of this threat. And final example on this, when we talk about military mobility, I mean, up to now we had only one bridge between Romania and Bulgaria where we can move things along on the east of both countries. We just came together and said, why we have one bridge? Let's have 5 bridges. I go to Greece and we're like, let's increase our interconnects with the gas supplies. So in other words, there is hope, because when it really gets tough, this is when you become creative, and then you realize the gain of working together. So I'm actually optimistic for the next decade if we have taken this lesson from the last decade, which we've lost, and say, okay, we don't want to lose another one.
Yeah, it's refreshing, because your attitude is we're not going to cry over spilt milk, we're going to get on and make our luck. And I think the energy transition possibilities coming out of this in Europe more broadly are really very, very exciting. Just a heads up to the audience, in a couple of minutes I'm going to come and say, you know, what would you like to put into the discussion? So just be thinking about what you'd like to say. Minister Hina, would you like to sort of maybe talk a little bit about what are the opportunities in Pakistan to innovate in response to the crises that you're facing?
Okay, so I think it's a bit more challenging to have a response to crisis, pretty much your type of situation, where the crises are not in your control, right? So the crisis on the border, for instance, is not something that we made, but it was handed over and then everybody left. We can't pluck ourselves up and leave, right? But then again, to try and look at it positively, I think there is a real possibility of the region working in a way that it has never worked. Which would require, so the only silver lining that I have seen in all of this is the potential for trade of Afghanistan with its neighbors, which includes obviously Pakistan and Uzbekistan. Now, what is happening at the same time is that because of what the US decided to do on their exchange, on their reserves, and because of the banking channels collapsing, the Afghan economy is not able to function at all, right? So you can, even as an international organization, if you want to take funds there. So that's, I think, where the world is actually enabling a disaster, which it should stop enabling and should start disabling immediately. Because that has an impact not only on Afghanistan, but the entire region. And of course, if the impact is only on Afghanistan, that's big enough. Now, looking at where Pakistan is, Pakistan has always talked about itself being a geostrategic location, right? But a geostrategic location, which is a positive geostrategic location, can only be such if we start trading with all of our neighbors. Now, the problem again is that one of our neighbors decide to go rogue, which is India. Now, the bigger problem then, the superimposed problem, is that the world has, however, is currently very enamored by that neighbor because it is part of the China containment policy. So I'm just giving you an example of how a country finds itself being the victim in some ways of international politics, international geopolitics, and I still want to take the positive on what can Pakistan do to assist itself. Okay, so when it comes to India, I don't think we can do much until India decides to at least stop being rogue on whether it's Indian-occupied Kashmir or it's the rights of the minorities. And when it comes to Pakistan also, what Pakistan can do is to be an image which is very different than the ones that we complain about. Okay, so in how we treat our minorities, in how politics in Pakistan ought to become less divisive. But there are some big takeaways on what Pakistan has done right. And to me, one of the biggest one is that in all of this fractured sort of politics around in our neighborhood, Pakistan and whatever economic impact we were having within Pakistan, and right now we also have an oil impact, by the way, which is coming out of the Ukrainian crisis, which is turning into a fiscal crisis. So who would have thought that the conflict in Ukraine would have a direct impact on fiscal space in Pakistan? But despite that, 10 years back, when we were in government earlier, and then all successive governments, which is actually a very big indication of positivity to me, decided to take it along, is that we decided to create a highway for the poor in Pakistan, where we said, okay, beyond a certain limit, everybody has to be supported through this thing called the Basic Income Support Program, which was targeting, by the way, women. So it said that the household receivers will be women so that their status in the household is also improved. So it turned out to be a very innovative and far-reaching, and has a far-reaching impact. And now we have built-in health insurance and many other, used it really as a platform and as a highway, so that when the Pakistani economy suffers from the shocks that it suffers, the poor are at least given a certain, a certain income that will go to their home.
A floor.
A floor in some ways. And I'm just going to perhaps leave you with this thought that South Asia happens to be a region which has benefited the least from being in its geography, which means that even the countries which have done well within South Asia have done it by trading with countries which are far, far away. So the best country performer in South Asia would also have intra-regional trade, which is less than 5%, which is not the norm anywhere, right? And just to say that on the trajectory that we thought we were going, with everybody having a reason to normalize, that trajectory has been broken because of the superimposition of the China containment policy and giving others a reason to now be sort of divided rather than together. So that to me is a very, very big challenge as we go forward, because I genuinely believe that if this region can't come together and be able to live, trade, invest in each other, have people-to-people contacts, etc., we will be held back by our geography and by our history. We want to be able to break free from both, not a geography obviously, but from a bad past, so to speak.
Thank you. Carolyn, any reflections on what we're hearing from these two very different national contexts?
You know, I think they're talking about, as policymakers, how many issues they have to deal with. We tend to think, since we're not in government, that government deals with one issue at a time, but all the issues come together. And I think, as I say, 2-3 years ago, there was a much more singular focus on how can we build back better, how can we deal with climate change, and now there are all these things coming in from left and right, politics, economics, culture. I do see some positive things, though. Greening of the supply chain. Companies are beginning to talk about that. There's greenwashing, we know, but there's also, I think, a sincere effort to try and look at that supply chain. I would like to see it be not just about the greening, but also taking responsibility for the health of people along your supply chain. Putting the S really in ESG, so it's not, the focus isn't all just on environment and governance, but also on social. We do a lot of work with artisanal miners who are mining cobalt or mica or many of the products we all use now in batteries and in our cell phones. They are really a forgotten workforce. And we love to talk in development about the last mile, about getting vaccines to the last mile, which means the communities. But really, these people are the first mile. They are the first mile on a supply chain that gives all of us what we need to live our lives. And we need to recognize their role and our dependence on them and begin to work with those communities. We need to certify these products. We need to trace their cradle-to-grave journey into our stores so that ultimately we know where was there child labor? Were people, did they have access to health care? What were the health and safety around the production? So I think that's also positive, but we have to build on it, and we have to hold companies accountable. I'm a little worried in this trust issue. We know that the polls say people don't trust government, but people have trusted business a little bit more. Yesterday, I was at a lunch with corporate CEOs, and it became clear that despite all the talk about progress on net zero, that 2030 may come and not a lot will have been done. And then I think disillusion will set in. And then you have to ask, well, who are people going to trust then? And are we going to have a backlash? And finally, I would say that Davos was really one of the homes of globalization 1.0. And now people are talking about deglobalization.
Absolutely.
And where I think globalization 1.0 went wrong was it didn't bring populations with it. We know people lost out. We know that people didn't get the education to retrain them for different jobs. We know that whole communities got left behind. As we go to deglobalization 2.0, it's imperative that leaders bring their publics with them. We have to, politicians, I can say because I'm not one, but have to win the politics of progress. And sometimes we feel that a lot of politicians look to blame what's happening external forces, and there's no question they're very tough. But it's also about healing inside and uniting your population. So when I hear deglobalization, I think we need to know what that means. Are suddenly people who've been producing in developing economies and emerging economies going to be now discarded because companies are bringing their supply chains home? When a lot of corporates talk about localization, they don't mean communities in emerging markets or developing. They mean bringing them home to their own countries, which has benefits, but it threatens leaving an awful lot of people behind. So let's have a debate of what that deglobalized world might look like. And let's be very clear who are going to be the winners and losers. And if there are losers, how are we going to support them?
Yeah, good question. Audience, now is your hour. Would anyone like to come in with any reflections or thoughts? I did mention Myanmar in passing, and I'm very conscious we have the UN Special Envoy for Myanmar, not only in a crisis which isn't in our headlines, but you're a very experienced, long-time international public servant. Any reflections you'd like to make about how we get back on course and try and rise above these challenges?
Thank you, Helen. I was listening very carefully. Sorry, I came in late, but I was very interested in this whole issue of localization. Because I think at the end of the day, because there's a collapse of trust in so many institutions, I think the new politics and the new empowerment and the agency and the dreaming, in a sense, will have to come from the local in a way that it will allow what people feel are the main challenges, but then we have to amplify it. So it can't just be the local, because the local has got to be supported by the national, by the regional. So in a sense, it is really getting that energy, but supported. So you can't leave the local alone and hope to just give them a bit of aid here and there. It has to be supported by good systems, good infrastructure, where the investment goes, and what the new business model could look like if people are to be supported. And what do they want to be supported? Is actually a future for their children. We cannot leave a future so devastated and hope that, that we can create stability and sustainability without creating that, and not even coming to the conflicts, and why there's such a lot of conflicts, and where even what I say in this country that I'm supposed to be helping, when I talk about social transformation, the people said, no, we want a revolution. We need a revolution. And what they mean is a total rethrowing out of what governance should look like. So it's not just the ESG, but really, how on earth do you root humanity at the center of the governance system and the politics that we have? Just a quick thought in the midst of dealing with conflicts of the worst kind.
A good thought, a very good thought, not just a quick thought.
Thank you so much. Anyone else like to come back to the panel with thoughts? Yes, in the front and then behind you.
Hi, my name is Jeremy. I'm a global shaper from Seychelles. We started by saying probably it was more of the more pessimistic challenges in terms of taking on. But actually, out of a lot of the panels I've listened to, I think this was the most optimistic approach to these very real, very big challenges. And coming from a small island state where, you know, dealing with climate crisis, it's not always possible to have that light shines and on your problems. But what I really appreciated was the talk around regional integration. It seems like when the old adage of when it's tough, the tough get going, but I think the smart actually get together and figure things out, and I see a lot of that happening. And there is a lot of history to get over, a lot of geography and geopolitics, I think, that are very, not just in Europe, across the world, but I think the trick is this approach, so I'm really glad to see that, because I think that's key. So that's just one reflection I'd like to make.
Well, I think as a panel we feel proud that we've turned this depressing outlook into something where we can innovate and move forward.
Absolutely.
So thank you for that. Just behind you, I think there was a hand up. Maybe not. Around here, yep.
Hi, I'm Sara Pantuliano from ODI. Hi. Great reflections. One thing I have perhaps not heard as much, and it's something I'm sort of thinking about all the time, is actually how the multilateral system has really struggled to come to the fore and really be seen to deliver during the pandemic. In many ways, we've seen a bit of a failure of the multilateral system, be that in terms of the delivery or in terms of the financing that has not been made available, to those that needed it. And if you look about the incredible level of fiscal stimulus we have seen in rich countries, what has actually been made available in terms of resources for low and middle income countries is like 0.05%. I think we have estimated to the eye. It's incredible. Now, building on Nolin's comment, one thing obviously going forward, we're going to struggle even more in terms of making the multilateral system work because of the paralysis that we can see given to the spillover of the crisis in Ukraine. And something that I've been reflecting a lot with colleagues at ODI is that perhaps we need to enter a different phase where, rather than the traditional multilateral system, we really try and bring that back to its normative, the standard setting, if you want, the function that it has. But for delivery, for really to advance progress, we need to turn to coalitions of like-minded actors that bring together governments, civil society, businesses, with shared goals and very sort of specific objectives that they want to achieve. And we've seen that very well in the climate space, where these coalitions are sort of coming together. We've seen them on the Vaccine Alliance, Gavi. There are examples, but I'd be interested in your reflections, because I think I think we need to have a quantum leap and move away from the traditional sort of multilateral system as we've seen it so far.
Yeah, very, very, very good question. I see our clock ticking, so I'm going to come back to the panel and say any reflections on the points that have been raised. Noeline talking about the new model. You're talking about new models there, and thank you for your optimistic comments. But you know, can we rise to the challenge as a world to move in directions that are more productive coming out of this?
I really like the comments that I just heard. So if we can say globalization 1.0 was actually global competition. And in global competition, how it works is that you have local know-hows, and then you try to sell to everybody in every other place. So in this globalization, it's more about competitive access of markets, which seem to have solved some problems but created others. What I think you all are referring to is globalization 2.0 is coordinated problem solving, which is very different than just global competition. If we can do a coordinated problem solving, then we become more powerful, stronger, the synergies are assessed. And that's a very different approach than globalization 1.0.
Yeah.
So I think localization is not the opposite of globalization, but it's local problem solving in a coordinated global way. I think that's the direction forward, at least from my point of view.
Yeah. Minister?
Okay, I'm going to try and weave this together, and let's see if I can, because I was particularly enamored by a comment that you made pertaining to coming to Davos and not saying the word sustainable anywhere, right? And that is what I generally feel that has happened in the last 2 years, that global goods are no more on the agenda as an active mission. And I also want to sort of weave this together to say that there are two things. One is deglobalization, which is a good thing, but needs to be managed in a way that it doesn't break anything. And, you know, there's a localization, but then the global goods remain the global goods, and the global infrastructure remain the global infrastructure, and the global systems remain global systems. And then there is the more challenging or difficult decoupling. There's a difference between deglobalization and decoupling. Deglobalization, good thing; decoupling, bad thing. If decoupling that we see, this charge towards decoupling, continues in the world system, then I fear, and I hope I'm not being overly pessimistic, but I truly fear the worst, because I think exactly what you're saying, sustainable SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, climate change, which affects all of humanity, are going to get off the agenda and off the radar screen. And when we sit here in this time, I like to imagine, what we're experiencing, is this a blip? Is this a turning point? Is this an inflection point? Because when history is written, really, you know, we've already forgotten Afghanistan. We will soon forget Ukraine, perhaps, and then we'll go on to the next big challenge. And then, you know, for the next 2 weeks, be really obsessed with it, and then we'll move on. But what we leave behind is real people and real impact and real ramifications and repercussions, not only for the people, but for the geography, for the region. So in some ways, trying to weave this together, there is a role that the multilateral systems have. Until the time that we have not come up with a better system, it's the only guarantee of security that is given to smaller states and medium-sized states. And when everybody starts looking for exceptions because they are able to justify their behavior because they are means to good ends and everybody else's behavior is means to bad ends, it creates a problematic situation. And that is what we're seeing right now. So because when you go against international law to do something because you think it's the right thing to do, but then when someone else does it, it's the wrong thing to do. That's a bit problematic. So I'm just going to perhaps weave this together and give the, maybe part of the problem.
A little time, we've only got 1 minute left. I have one sentence at the end.
Just last thing, that the global agenda setting has been the affair of the developed world. I think the challenge is that the developing world is saying, we have the ability to set the agenda, where is our share of having a voice in that global agenda setting?
Carolyn, you're watching that clock.
I will just say on the multilateral system, it's going to be harder because it's now divided and not everybody's on the same page. We've got big countries that are not together. On the multilateral financial system, I think we really have to ask, are our institutions fit for purpose? They are not taking the degree of risk. They're meant to go in and invest when no one else will. They're too much a status quo issue now. They have to have new instruments around debt. They have to be much more forward-looking. Let's look at a new multilateral financial system for a globalization 2.0. And I think we can bring it all together in a way that is positive.
Fantastic. And I think taking out of it, the themes that really came through were localization, the need for regionalization as we look for solutions, energy transition, got a good plug as well, the human dimensions of globalization, which were overlooked and need to be built back into the paradigm, and then your new era 2.0 of coordinated public policy approaches. So great panel. Please join me in giving them a hand.
Absolutely.